Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the conversation today about successful collaboration in Office 365. I'm Brian Edwards, the Director of Products and Services here at Habanero, and I started our collaboration practice about 17 years ago and have had a keen interest in this space ever since. So excited to share this topic with you. So today's webinar format is going to be a conversation between myself and one of our digital workplace advisors, Chris Radcliffe. And we're going to be discussing what we're seeing in the market around companies that are being successful with modern collaboration, especially around Office 365. We will be recording the webinar today, so if you want to listen to it later, we'll make sure we send the link off to those who registered for the webinar. And we'll leave about 10 minutes at the end for questions. So feel free to put those questions into the GoToWebinar software to grab our attention. So without further ado, let's get started. So Chris, thanks for sitting down with me today. This is a topic we both care about really deeply, this topic of enterprise collaboration. And, I think of all the places that Habanero works to help create better workplace experiences. I know you and I think that helping people collaborate better within their organizations is really high on our list. But it's also an area that's really changing. And so today, obviously, the topic is modern collaboration. And I'd love to get your thoughts on what you're seeing out there. What's new, what we're seeing working, what's getting in the way of success, how organizations are forming around this idea of modern collaboration. So thank you, Chris. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Great to be here.
So maybe we'll start with you just introducing yourself.
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's Chris Radcliffe. I'm a digital workplace advisor for organizations in Canada, work with Habanero.
Great. And maybe to give a little bit to the spirit of why this interview or this particular question is important to you, modern collaboration. Why are you interested in this topic? Why is this an important topic for you?
I just love helping people take the friction out of their work. We've worked with so many organizations over the years that have struggled, balancing content and working on teams that are disconnected, and they've got so much friction in their life, in their digital life, that it's so exciting to see the impact that we can have when we show them a better way of working.
That's great. And on the topic of modern collaboration, so let's kind of define it for the people that are listening today. What is modern collaboration? Like, how is modern collaboration different than perhaps how we would have collaborated 5 or 10 years ago?
Well, when I think of collaboration, I think about, I define it by the sort of concept of helping people and teams work really effectively together on a common task, whether that's a project or some kind of outcome that they have at work. And probably 10, 15 years ago, collaboration was very document centric. It was all about document management features and security and version control and checking in, checking out. And you could almost interchange the word collaboration with team sites. And today it's so different. I mean, we're really not even looking at one application anymore. There's tons of different tools and capabilities that people are using and stitching together to create a really powerful collaboration experience for teams. It's not just documents, but I mean, documents are really still quite important. And managing that content and the collaboration process of creating the content is still very important. But there's been a whole shift in the ecosystem of tools that organizations use to support their teams. And whether it's through adding additional capabilities that help them connect more effectively through features like chat or discussion threads or conversations, or whether it's changing the actual channel that people are using to communicate ideas with concepts like video, or embedding different types of capabilities that help people stay organized, like with tools like Planner. It's just a huge ecosystem that exists today as opposed to one or two core tools and platforms.
Why would you say that's happening? Like, what is different in the enterprise now than perhaps back again 5 or 10 years ago? Is it the enterprise changing and the environments different, or is it that the tools are just becoming more advanced and they're sort of pushing the envelope on what organizations are doing?
There's no question in my mind that with the advancements that have come with Office 365 and more broadly with cloud computing in general, we've been able to expand across so many different types of tools that provide a capability or a service for a type of collaboration. And there have been no shortage of external commercially available tools in our life, whether it's your personal private life or available on the web that people can use and subscribe to. So it's really created a lot of opportunity for individuals to figure out what tools they could be using to create a better experience for their work life.
Right. So there's a bunch of new tools out there. And, I think we hear the term the consumerization of IT. Are people disrupting the enterprise by bringing these tools into the enterprise themselves? Like, what are you seeing there?
They definitely are. We see a lot of organizations are struggling with the concept of shadow IT, where different groups, different departments, or individuals are subscribing to services externally, whether they're free services or they're paying with them through a credit card, and they're enabling teams on their own. And so, it's a pull that's happening from within the organization. And I think there's also an interesting push where, in order to remain competitive, companies like Microsoft and other competitors are working really hard to innovate and find new and exciting ways to help people collaborate. And that's introducing a lot of new capabilities and types of technology to support different sort of modes of collaboration.
And that move, the idea that folks like Microsoft are really pushing technology out to support organizations change. I mean, that kind of fits into the narrative of what some people call the digital workplace. What do you think is, and maybe perhaps even digital transformation? What do you think is the goal right now for organizations around digital transformation? Is it include collaboration?
It definitely does. When we think of collaboration these days, we don't really think of it on its own. It's often anchored into a broader conversation around how an organization could transform its employee experience. And there's just a shared sense of urgency across all of the companies we work with that they're really working hard to remain competitive in their own spaces, in their own industries. And I think as a result, that's really pushing the envelope internally in terms of how they create, the most compelling internal workplace experience for their employees. And when they start thinking about collaboration, it's really tightly stitched together with, their intranets, their records management systems, all of their applications, business apps that provide value or provide a service or support tasks for their employees. And so often we find companies are really integrating the vision of what their intranet could be with a broader understanding of the tools that are being offered through platforms like Office 365 to provide a really compelling collaboration experience for their employees.
And what does that mean to some of the other things that we've seen traditionally in the digital workplace, like intranets, or perhaps some of the new entrants like ServiceNow and business process tools? How do these things stitch together?
For a lot of companies, they are starting to think about what the ecosystem looks like in terms of the experience from the end user or the employee's perspective. And it's not necessarily siloed in these different applications or user experience paradigms. And I think that's a really exciting thing, to be honest. I think
Totally.
for a long time, you would see, whether it was SAP or SuccessFactors or, the Microsoft space, they would be these giant platforms that were very independent. They provide different services, different capabilities, and there was really no shared understanding or shared experience across them all. And I see a lot of companies that are starting to actually take a step back and try to understand what are the core capabilities that each of these platforms will provide, and what's that overarching experience that they're trying to create or stitch together that makes it easier for an employee to navigate from one area to the other. And there's no question we see intranets at the heart of that. Intranets still play that foundational grounding mechanism to connect people into the different applications and really provide almost a harmonizing effect. And a lot of companies are trying to connect the collaboration experience with that foundational intranet.
Right. So collaboration as a part of the ecosystem, one of the first things we see organizations doing to be successful is getting that lay of the land. Where does this fit? How does this fit into Office 365? Kind of looking at that systems thinking view of those employee experiences and taking stock as a first step.
Absolutely. And 2-3 years ago, companies were really spending a lot of time getting to the cloud. They were working on setting up their tenants, working on, the Active Directory, federation, synchronization, kind of getting the foundation in order with Exchange and OneDrive. And the chapters are starting to turn. So the pages are turning, and companies are looking at now the broader productivity and collaboration experience and starting to think about how they can unlock a lot of the value that's based in these platforms.
Yeah, I mean, since you mentioned it, I think that implementation approach of moving to the cloud was sort of a lift and shift, and let's move everything from this on-prem into this cloud environment, and maybe oversimplified the idea that they could just turn things on and they would magically have more capabilities and more features. But I don't see that as the experience most employees are having with Office 365. What's your opinion on the current state of the average employee in terms of their view on how easy it is to collaborate?
Sadly, I think the average employee is struggling. I definitely hear a lot of confusion in the market, and it exists for good reason. There's a lot of overlapping capabilities in the technology across these different tools, the different platforms. And even sometimes within a platform like Office 365, you could have 2 or 3 components, whether it's groups or teams or SharePoint or Yammer, that often will provide a similar looking concept. And so it can be sometimes quite confusing for end users to understand if there's been no guidance or instruction on what they're supposed to be using for different types of scenarios or different types of collaboration. They could get stuck and not really understand, or they might use one particular tool for one group and then a different tool for another, and all of a sudden you've got 3 or 4 different ways of working together, which starts to feel a little chaotic.
Right. So the role of the people that are helping implement these tools is really to, again, go back to your first idea there, is thinking about the employee experience and what you're trying to create and helping them through those challenges. Who do you think owns this? Like, whose challenge is this in the organization to work with employees and take stock of the tools? Is this an IT job?
Well, certainly IT is at the table and leading the conversation. And I would argue it's also the role of HR or whoever's in charge of people and the experience that the employees are meant to be having. They should also be a key sponsor to help shape a vision and also be able to anchor the work and have the right type of investments or funding behind the scenes to make these projects happen.
So if you were to wave a magic wand for an organization that's on this Office 365 journey, it would at least have a representative from IT. Probably, I'm going to put this out there, probably not just the infrastructure group, who we see sometimes taking on the initial implementation, because their view is perhaps maybe more product oriented. Is that something you'd agree with?
Yeah, that's totally fair. I think often what we see is the infrastructure team is essential at getting the foundation in place. They're fantastic at setting up that initial infrastructure and being able to make it easy for employees to use their everyday credentials. But beyond that, you really need a team that's able to consult and connect with the business and understand what they're doing on a day-to-day basis and figure out where there's friction. And there's some decision making that has to happen around the making sense of all of the options and then providing a cohesive collaboration strategy or a set of services for the end user. So there's a little bit of a marriage of the needs that exist and the tools that are out there that needs to happen in order for a great experience to be set up for the employees.
Great. So an effective team would be something that is A, on the technology side, but B, has some form of an engagement process with end users, be it through analysis or working with end users on their needs and defining what tools fit when. What do you think the best approach to doing that is? Because in the past, that might have been done with a traditional waterfall, go out, gather some requirements, come back, build something approach. Is that what we're seeing right now?
Some organizations are trying to do that. I see them struggling in a little bit of analysis paralysis, to be honest. I think I would really advocate for more of a lean, iterative approach where you inject some education into the conversations. So the folks you're talking to within the business, they learn about the art of the possible, and you can quickly look at prototyping or creating a proof of concept or getting something in their hands quickly to be able to test the capabilities against the needs that they have. And then you can refine and almost have a bit of a rhythm around that type of cycle. And ultimately, I think organizations need to think of this as a service that they're offering. It's a collaboration service. And so they need to understand how they're going to market that service, how they're going to support requests when they come in, and how they're going to deploy the service or provide the solutions. And you could almost see it being, if it's set up well and if it's run well, you could see the types of education showing up on the intranet, or it could be offered through a ServiceNow, service page. You can see people creating the concept of a backlog or some sort of prioritized list of requests, and then ultimately creating net new sites, net new teams, net new groups, or deploying and configuring the capability and providing the support to help people with the change as they're moving from their old way of collaborating to the new world.
That totally makes sense. Like I think it's one of the promises of the cloud, of course, is that you don't have a lot of infrastructure and time and effort in order to spin these solutions up. Like whereas in the past, it may have been, go implement a server and get it running and all the security set up. And with a cloud, that's just a lot easier. So that shift to the traditional way of thinking about how you might implement this to something that's, like you said, more lean or agile, totally makes sense. What role would you say does Office 365 have in all of this? We've kind of touched on the platform. Would you consider this the collaboration platform for most organizations?
Almost every organization we talk to is an Office 365 shop, or they've invested in Office 365. They have the licensing for it. They're leveraging it for their mail, their email, and their OneDrive, and they might have already launched Yammer, or they're in the midst of relaunching Yammer, and they're starting to look beyond that. I can't remember what the stats are, but it's in the like 70, 80, 90% range that most organizations have really invested and anchored into Office 365. So it is essential in terms of the broader shift that's happening in the marketplace, and Microsoft's injecting a ton of innovation on a regular basis. So it's really having a huge role on how we're collectively as a society changing our practices and behaviors.
Yeah, like we might have seen. I totally agree in that we might have seen tools like Slack, which I like, as they entered the market, really invented something new, or were game changers in some ways around how we think about collaboration. But Microsoft's approach to updating their stack seems to be really rapid. But with that kind of rapid change, I think comes a lot of IT challenge and maybe even end user challenge, because there's just so much change going on. How do you see companies wrapping their heads around that change? What are some effective ways that they're getting around managing that?
Well, there's really two types of changes that we see. The first is the incremental change that is really happening all the time. And in most cases, the end user doesn't even notice it. It's graceful, it shows up. There might be a slight, change in terms of a new feature added, or, the placement of a particular button has evolved. And that's really being based on a lot of their analytics and the data and the testing that they're doing. And it's just really gracefully happening. And then I'd say the other type of change is more the opposite, where it's pretty disruptive, where a whole new capability set gets all of a sudden launched or lit up in your tenant. And more often than not, what happens is people are scrambling. They're trying to figure out, what is it? Do we need to know what this is? Is it going to add value? Where does it show up in our roadmap? And it becomes a really chaotic process for companies to try and figure out how to get their heads wrapped around it, first of all. And then secondly, how to govern it or how to introduce it in a safe and secure way. And then thirdly, how to actually introduce it and roll it out to the broader end user community. And so it's really important, I think, for companies to figure out who's accountable for staying on top of that. Who in IT or within the digital teams is staying on top of the Microsoft roadmap, watching the blogs, staying on top of their communication, because they're quite well organized now in terms of how they're rolling things out. It's just a matter of, staying on top of it and then evaluating it quickly and figuring out how it's going to fit into your broader strategy.
That totally makes sense. So just to kind of take stock of where we're at, one of the first things we talked about was organizations need to look at that digital ecosystem and evaluate which tool when, and try and understand where Office 365 or tools like that fit into their vision for what they're trying to do for end users. Thinking about it through the lens of the employee experience and really diving into what that ideal employee experience would look like. Taking stock of the ownership model in the organization. So defining kind of who is at the table, helping make these decisions, who's accountable for these things to be successful, setting up the right agile environment or engagement. So, and agile being my word, but you used lean or more sprint-driven approach. And then thinking of this as a service within the organization. So you've had, so this ecosystem of things we just talked about, or this sort of process, you've had some experience recently with a client. And one of the things that stood out for me when we talk about that experience is, how you decided to engage end users, who was at the table, what that initial work looked like. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, how did that engagement go? What did we do with IT to work with a team of people to look at their problem and talk through that?
Great question. So 2 things happened that were really powerful. One was, with this particular organization, we brought together a collection of people who all were really passionate about technology, but they were from the business. So they represented subject matter experts across different regions. They volunteered, so they were really interested in being part of this group, and we called it a community group or a working group that was looking at different ways to take advantage of the technology and improve collaboration experiences. And we met on a regular basis. So we met every couple of weeks. We would have a session to, talk, a bit of a roundtable almost, to talk about what's going on in their area of the business. And that allowed us to connect and understand, what's working, what's not working, where people are experiencing friction or where adoption might be really struggling. And from that, we were able to recognize opportunities. So there would be obvious candidate projects or ways we could leverage groups or Planner or Teams or SharePoint Online and solve a discrete office, a discrete business challenge and collaboration challenge. And that was a great way for us to essentially create that backlog. So we understood quite quickly where all those opportunities were, and we were able to prioritize them. And as we started working through, creating solutions and configuring each of those little initiatives, we recognized that everybody was super engaged, and even if they weren't part of that exact solution, the broader community group and working group, they understood what we were doing. They followed along the process. We kept them in the loop from a communication standpoint. And they were able to bring a lot of that insight back into their part of the business. And that in itself almost started fueling more feedback and more input around where there were more opportunities. And it just made for a really engaged stakeholder community. And when it came time to actually launch, we had people who were on board. We were finding that the power users or those subject matter experts were actually doing a lot of the training themselves, helping with a lot of the communications and change management on the ground in their own particular environment. So we really recognized afterwards that was a recipe for success, not only in helping us kind of cast the net out and understand where we could add value, but also down the road, it created for a much more engaged community that wanted to change, and they were able to help us drive the change. So we weren't pushing it. They were really helping to move these new practices into their work environment, and they could basically sell the change that's happening to a lot of their colleagues.
Right. So it sounds like they shifted from this idea of having a business need as their core function to almost being power users of the system and helping others
Exactly.
make sense of it.
Totally.
Yeah. So we mentioned we a lot in that, and I know that obviously your role as a digital workplace specialist is kind of jumping in and helping organizations figure this out. How have you seen your role shift in the way that they engage folks like Habanero and companies engage folks on their journey around collaboration?
Great question. I think there was a time where we would be handed, a set of requirements, or we would be told about a problem space, and it was very clearly defined where we were meant to focus, and we would go in and talk to some people and have some discussions and requirements discovery, and we would be able to craft a solution. And now I find more often than not there's a much broader mandate to help improve the employee experience and help companies transform. And I think a big part of our role now is to act as advisors for this broader change that's happening, and help organizations understand where they have capability and also capacity internally to drive this change, and where they may have gaps, and or where they may not be totally ready and need some support. So part of what we do now is, we really help them put the structure in place. We help provide the mechanism for them to engage with the business, or we often teach their internal teams how to do that. And we help make sense of this whole ecosystem of content and tools that they may have on premise or in other applications. And we help map that into the new Office 365 domain, so they understand how they can take that old world and bring it into the new world and start to move forward with the broader ecosystem of tools at their disposal.
So if I were to summarize that, I'd say we've moved from a more of a delivery function, producing something for customers, to more of a mentor role for their Office 365 journey.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So what, if you were to give one piece of advice to someone that is just starting this journey out, and let's say they've implemented Office 365 and now they're starting to wrap their heads around everything that we just talked about today, what's a good first step for them, or what's a piece of advice for them?
I would probably suggest two things. One is I would recommend or highly suggest you kind of check your own bias and be aware of your bias when you start looking at the different tools. Everybody we talk to is really excited about something, and they think one tool or technology is the best and everything else is terrible. And you see that a lot where people are promoting Teams. It's, we got to use Teams for this or Teams for that. Or maybe it's, we got to use Yammer and start, exploring how Yammer could solve this problem. And what I've come to recognize is that you have to almost check your bias when you start talking to a particular business, and encourage them to get to the end users and talk to people in the trenches who are trying to get work done every day. Because Office 365 gives you an incredible toolkit that has many different options at your disposal, and they all could play a role in some way, shape, or form. And it's up to you to figure out what that is, and not just, try to jam the same technology or same solution in because you think that's the best of them all.
Totally. I mean, if anything, we personally have, using these technologies at Habanero, I've learned just many ways to tackle a problem. And it's more about experimentation and finding, what works for you individually or as a team.
Exactly.
So I think it was a great way to start to wrap. I have a few fast fire questions for you. I have a few fast fire questions for you. Okay. Your favorite collaboration tool?
Yammer.
Oh, interesting. What do you like about that? I know I'm making it not so fast.
That's okay. I just love how Yammer connects experts in organizations in ways that companies would have never imagined. I worked with one organization, which is a transportation company, and within about 3 weeks of their Yammer network launching, we saw all kinds of connections happen across the organization in ways that we never imagined. And it was incredible to see how a community would wrap itself around a particular question or problem in ways that would have never been possible otherwise with other tools, or even to be doing it manually, across the regional, silos in the organization.
Totally. Yeah. I've heard the term culture builder around Yammer from a few clients for sure. Your favorite collaboration feature?
My favorite feature? Oh, boy, there's so many good ones. I would have to say I'm really excited about the new modern site hub capability in SharePoint Online. I think how hubs and hub sites can connect all kinds of different team sites together and create like a loosely stitched together ecosystem is just going to be a huge thing for companies. And I see a lot of chaos in the whole team site collaboration space, and I think we're going to see that world get a lot more organized going forward.
That's great. I totally agree, especially in larger, complex organizations where, just a minefield of collaboration spaces or team sites that don't stitch together is just more and more difficult to maintain and navigate, and end users have a lot of challenge around that.
Exactly.
Your favorite non-Microsoft technology?
Ooh, I love my Google Home.
Why is that?
We've just, from the day we got it, it's just been so much fun to be able to interact and talk to a device as opposed to type into the device. And I could see so many different ways that, that type of technology will really enhance the workplace experience too, when we're able to, search for something by just talking to our computers, or walking into a room and setting all the different pieces, whether it's the lighting or the projector or the Wi-Fi, and having it all just kind of come together and be able to bring these things to life through commands versus having to interface through a device, keyboard or a screen of some sort.
Yeah, totally. I have Alexa at home. I almost doubt yours could be as good as Alexa, so we should have a conversation about that. So I'm just going to one more time recap some of the key points here for people who are trying to understand how to wrap their heads around what this journey could look like, and some of the things that we've recommended today. So we and you feel free to step in here, Chris. We first talked about taking stock of that environment and what kind of capabilities you have in the platforms that you've chosen, especially with Office 365. There's so much there. And creating a vision around where you want to head with these tools. Think about it from the lens of the employee experience, and really putting yourself into the end user shoes when you're doing this, as opposed to kind of thinking of it from a tools rollout perspective. Looking at the ownership model within the organization, defining who's at the table and who's driving the ship when it comes to enterprise collaboration. And it sounds like it obviously is your recommendations would be it's a team of more than just IT, but perhaps HR or others. Looking at the way that you deliver this stuff. So trying to implement something that's a bit more lean or sprint driven, as opposed to the kind of traditional top-down requirements driven, because you have the ability to do that in these tools, and it's a great way to engage with end users. Organizations should be thinking about this as a collaboration service. So all of the service experiences that come with thinking of it as a service, from how people ask and get the support and what kind of support they need, and the long-term sustainment and support they get after they've started implementing. And then a big one around organizations need to wrap their heads around how they're going to manage change and who's accountable for that change, as it comes to little tiny things and feature rollouts to bigger things, such as large holistic changes in the way the platform works. And working with someone like us could be a good way to build some mentorship within the organization and help us build facility capacity and capability that organizations don't currently have. So one last thing I'd love to ask you is, if I think about the one common thing I hear in this space from IT folks, it's that a lot of what we just talked about feels like it's a lot of work, and can't we just turn on the technology? The cloud is self-service, and people are doing this all over the place with their own personal applications. They turn on Dropbox. They sort of figured that out. Why can't we just plug and play on this stuff? What would be your last words of advice for that person?
It's interesting. I think you can definitely get caught in a situation where IT is doing one of two things. They're either turning things on and, opening up the opportunity to leverage a tool, but they're not thinking through what the broader process is for actually supporting the end users. And that's resulting in a lot of chaos. And I think the other dirty little secret out there is that a lot of IT departments are turning things off. So they're actually locking down a lot of the capabilities and, not shifting the culture, not opening up, opportunities for people to discover new ways of working. And they're trying to really control the environment. And I think both approaches are really wrong. I think you've got to be open-minded and you've got to think through what's the long-term need that the employees have, and what needs to be true in order to have a successful experience. Can we just send an email out and let people know that this new feature exists? Will they be able to figure it out? Or is there a different process in place that you need to set up and structure and roll out to provide training and support, perhaps migration support, configuration support, and or is there a group like your help desk or various business analysts in IT that could come together and form that digital team? And I think the big question is, how do you organize that in a way that feels like you're staying on top of a lot of the new capabilities that are coming out, and you're not just sort of letting them all fly past you?
Right. Great. That's a great parting thoughts. So, Chris, thanks for joining me on the interview today. It was a great discussion around the modern collaboration.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Thanks, Brian. I appreciate it.
All right, then. Feel free to ask any questions in the GoToWebinar software. We recognize this is a relatively broad topic, and what we decided to focus on today in terms of the conversation may not be exactly where you're at. So if you are looking for some advice or have a question around your Office 365 implementation or how to be successful with collaboration, let's test the experts and go ahead and put them into the GoToWebinar software, and we'll try to answer them for you. In fact, we already have one here around, Chris, I have pre-sent it to you. Well, we can talk about this one together. How do Slack and Office 365 compare for collaboration? Is one better than the other? And so I think my opinion on it, I'll pipe in first, Chris. So we've had a chance to take a look at Slack, and Microsoft is really, I guess, competed with Slack with the release of its Teams functionality in Office 365. And some of the functions they were pulling together. One of the advantages of Slack is you get this persistent chat experience. It sort of replaces the idea of email by creating a unified place for those messages to go and live long term. It has an idea of a persistent team, so one that's not sort of temporary, but exists more long term, unlike certain other approaches. And so you can add and remove people from the team as they join. And so Microsoft's, I would say, competing with that with its Teams function, and it's done a fairly good job at it. In many ways, I think they've kind of mocked or borrowed a lot of the technology concepts from Slack. The advantages in the Office 365 ecosystem that I see personally is the idea of a group or a team in Office 365. It applies to all of the Office 365 functions. So Yammer, Planner, and all of these other tools in Office 365, they come alive for those groups. So if you're a group that also happens to need some task management, or you're a group that also happens to need a way to pull and share with other people in your organization, those things are available to you. Whereas in Slack, you kind of have a bit more of a smaller ecosystem of tools at your fingertips. I'm obviously a little biased here as we help implement Office 365. Chris, do you want to step in and give your opinion on that one?
Yeah, no, that's a great answer, Brian. I don't have too much more to add. At the end of the day, they're both teams within Office 365 and Slack both are team oriented, in their design. And, the biggest difference I think organizations are experiencing is that broader connected ecosystem from an Office integration and interrelationship standpoint. Microsoft obviously is working on a much sort of broader story than just the core capabilities that are offered within Slack from a communication and sort of team-based information sharing standpoint. So, Slack's still a great tool, but certainly doesn't feel like they've cracked into the enterprise space in a dominant way. That's my 2 cents.
That's great. Thank you, Chris. We have another question here. If you want to explore the functionality of some of the Office 365 tools beyond just the marketing materials, do you have any recommendation for learning resources out there?
Yeah, great question. So there's a lot. You can definitely start within the Fast Track program, and depending on your relationship with Microsoft and who's on your account team or a partner, you can ask them to point you to a lot of the core foundational training materials. There is an enormous amount, and it also goes much deeper in the TechNet space, so you can get more developer or SharePoint administration oriented advice. And different groups, different product groups within Microsoft are also starting to release unique white papers. Like I just saw one the other day for governance related tips for, I believe it was forms and Power Apps. So that's starting to come out too, which is really useful, when you're starting to get your head wrapped around all the decisions you need to make in order to deploy and manage a lot of these capabilities. And just before the summer, we also saw some announcements about a new training offering that Microsoft is going to be, I believe it's in beta at this point, that you can sign up for or request to be a part of. And that's an opportunity to be able to leverage training resources that Microsoft has been managing and share those within your tenant and your employee ecosystem. So a bunch of different options depending on who the audience is that you're trying to get up to speed and the type of sort of learning objectives that you have.
Yeah, and there's one resource too. It's in the one of the things I find that people exploring Office 365 have to wrap their heads around is the overlap between the tools and how does a group relate to a team? What's the difference between Yammer and other kinds of chat? And so one of the things I would recommend is just to wrap your head around that alone is if you were to Google Office 365 tools overlap and look at the images that come up in that. There's some interesting resources there from the Microsoft Tech community. There's one specifically from a company, ICANN SharePoint, where they try to sort of present that visually and how these tools connect with each other, how teams are pervasive across all of these different functions. That might be a good place to start to wrap your heads around the capabilities in the platform. Yeah, ultimately, just one last thing to add to that. Ultimately, I think this is a really important part of everyone's Office 365 journey is to try to start to figure out how to collect these and share them in a way within the organization that makes sense to that organization. As Chris said earlier, that education piece, we tend to think that comes last after you've implemented the tool, and in sort of a modern agile approach, it's sort of introducing all the capabilities and then using the team dynamics to figure out, well, what works for this team as an approach. There doesn't seem to be any more questions, so we'll give another minute here or another 30 seconds here for people to ask questions. Again, broad topic, so we sort of really focused on the kind of fundamentals around how and what we see in organizations to be successful, but if you do have something that's more narrow, feel free to ask it.
One thing I'd love to just plant a seed with everyone on the call still. We'd love to hear your feedback on this discussion today in terms of what you thought of the content, the format, and specifically how it relates to where your particular organization is at. If you're interested and able, we'd love you to shoot us a quick email and just share some of those thoughts, and it'll help us kind of shape future events and presentations like this and the type of material that we curate for the community.
All righty, no other questions came in, so I will thank everyone for attending today. It was great to have your attention for the last 45 minutes, and hopefully it was helpful for you in your Office 365 journey. And we look forward to talking with you later about how to be successful in Office 365. Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day.